The surrender had come, not with a bang, but a long, drawn-out sigh that seemed to settle over the entire Japanese archipelago. The once deafening roars of warplanes and artillery had faded into an unsettling quiet, replaced by the hushed whispers of a defeated populace. Autumn of 1945, and Yokohama, a city that had once pulsed with the vibrant rhythms of international trade and culture, now lay largely prostrate, its skeletal remains of bombed-out buildings reaching like gnarled fingers towards the indifferent sky. Twisted rebar and crumbled concrete choked thoroughfares, testament to the relentless aerial bombardments. Yet, amid the widespread desolation, life, stubborn and persistent, clung to the periphery. Makeshift markets cobbled together from salvaged scraps of wood and canvas sprang up in the shadow of collapsing walls. The vendors, their faces etched with weariness, hawked meager wares, their cries a fragile, almost defiant counterpoint to the city's omnipresent silence. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth, woodsmoke from countless small fires and an intangible aroma of national grief, carried an undercurrent of tension, a fragile calm that felt perpetually on the verge of splintering. It was a disorienting peace, a reality where conquerors in their crisp uniforms walked among the conquered, their roles starkly defined by the flags they represented and the power they now wielded. For Sergeant John Miller, a veteran whose body bore the scars of Guadalcanal's jungle and Iwo Jima's volcanic ash, the transition from savage combat to the tedious routines of urban occupation was less a liberation than a different kind of burden. He had seen humanity stripped bare, reduced to its most primal instincts, both in himself and his enemies. He'd witnessed acts of unspeakable brutality, and, in the fog of war, had committed those born of necessity. Now, with the official enemy vanquished, he found himself grappling with a new, insidious adversary, the lingering shadows of conflict. They lurked in the suspicious, often haunted glances of the locals, in the profound weariness etched into their faces, and in the silent suffering that seemed to pervade every corner of this vanquished land. Miller was cynical, profoundly so, his soul weathered by the relentless tide of human cruelty, but deep within him, a core moral compass, though often tested and bent, still spun, stubbornly seeking a true north in this morally inverted world. Each night, as he led his small patrol through the unfamiliar, blacked-out streets of Yokohama, the weight of their victory felt heavy, oppressive, and he often questioned the true cost of their hard-won peace. His men, young, often naive, some still harboring an eager curiosity for the exotic, others merely counting the interminable days until rotation, represented a spectrum of reactions to this strange new peace. He saw their reflections in the shattered plate glass of darkened shop fronts, faces still relatively fresh, yet to bear the profound, bone-deep weariness that had settled irrevocably into his own. The tragedy of the comfort women was a silent, festering wound in the heart of the nation, a brutal reality few dared to acknowledge, fewer still to speak of. These thousands of women, forcibly conscripted into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army, had endured years of unimaginable degradation and torment. The official surrender, a moment meant to signify the end of suffering, had, for many, delivered only a new, more profound form of abandonment. Deemed irreversibly defiled, ostracized by their own families and communities, stripped of their dignity, their youth, and their future, they were cast adrift in a world that had no place for their unspeakable trauma. In the immediate chaotic breakdown of social order, where authority was fractured, and justice a forgotten, irrelevant concept, many of these women, bereft of protection, fell prey to opportunistic local guards, collaborators, or simply desperate, cruel men who saw their utter vulnerability as an invitation to perpetuate their exploitation. They were the true forgotten, the invisible, their silent suffering a guttural scream echoing unheard in the core of a shattered nation. One such place, a repurposed school building on the blighted outskirts of the city, had been hastily designated a transition center. Its ostensible purpose was to provide temporary housing for displaced women, war widows, those awaiting repatriation, or simply those with nowhere else to go. But the promise of sanctuary was a cruel, deceptive mirage. Understaffed, woefully mismanaged, and utterly devoid of proper oversight, The center had quickly degenerated into a hunting ground for those who preyed on the most vulnerable. It was a place where hope, if it ever dared to flicker, was brutally extinguished. Miller led his patrol, Private Davis, a fresh-faced kid from Kansas, and Corporal Jenkins, a more jaded but solid presence, through the serpentine alleys that wound between the skeletonized remains of what were once factories and warehouses. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of their boots on gravel and debris, and the distant, mournful, almost spectral cry of a street hawker echoing across the desolate blocks. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint metallic tang of the nearby harbor, mingled with the bitter scent of industrial decay. Miller's senses remained sharply honed, his gaze ceaselessly scanning every shadow, every darkened doorway, every broken window. This wasn't about the threat of an armed ambush, the expected dangers of war. This was about the more insidious, pervasive threats that festered in the quiet, overlooked corners of a world ripped apart. His young men, too, seemed to feel the oppressive weight of the night, their usual, sometimes crude banter entirely subdued. Then it came. A sound. It wasn't the sharp crack of a rifle, nor the concussive boom of an explosion, but something far more chilling, far more visceral. A raw, desperate human cry choked mid-scream, followed by a series of sickeningly muffled thuds and harsh guttural shouts. It was distant at first, a faint, disturbing anomaly in the city's mournful hum, but it was unmistakably a sound of profound pain, of someone's terror. Miller froze, every muscle in his body instantly tensing, his combat instincts flaring into hyper-alertness. This wasn't some drunken brawl, this was violence, stark and deliberate. "Hold up," he murmured, his voice low, raising a hand in a universal gesture of caution. His men, equally attuned to the sudden shift in atmosphere, instantly tensed, their rifles subtly adjusting their grip. "Hear that?" Davis, his youngest, newest recruit, nodded, his face pale and stark in the dim urban glow. "Yeah, Sarge. What is it?" His voice was barely a whisper, betraying his unease. "Trouble," Miller clipped, his eyes narrowing, already tracing the sound's trajectory. "Sounds like real trouble." He motioned them forward, a subtle flick of his head, moving with a practiced, almost preternatural grace that belied his profound weariness. They slipped through a narrow, jagged gap in a rusting chain-link fence, past the derelict husk of a factory, its broken windows like vacant eyes. The metallic clink of their equipment, though minimal, seemed amplified in the silence, yet remained strangely muted by their cautious steps. As they drew nearer, the horrifying cacophony intensified. Coarse, mocking laughter, the angry, sharp bark of commands in Japanese, punctuated by desperate, whimpering pleas that tore at the fabric of the night. The sound was undeniably emanating from the old school building, the transition center. Miller felt a cold, hard knot of dread tighten in his gut. He'd had a bad feeling about this place, had heard the hushed, ugly whispers among the local populace, but the official reports always remained pristine, always antiseptically clean. They discovered a makeshift back entrance, a heavy wooden door hanging precariously, half open, its frame splintered as if repeatedly forced. Miller gave a silent hand signal, and Davis, without a word, nudged it wider with his boot, revealing a corridor that vanished into suffocating darkness, leading deeper into the building's oppressive interior. The sounds of abuse were now sickeningly clear, amplified and distorted by the confined concrete walls. Miller took the lead, his M1 Garand held ready, his heart beginning to pound a rhythmic, controlled beat of rising rage. He reached another door, less a door than a tattered curtain of burlap, and shoved it aside. The scene that unfolded before him slammed into his consciousness with the physical force of a brutal blow. The room was a cramped, airless space, illuminated by the desperate, flickering glow of a single kerosene lantern, suspended precariously from a hook. Its weak yellow light cast long, grotesque shadows that danced and writhed, distorting the horrific tableau within. The air was putrid, thick with the acrid stench of stale sweat, fear, and something Miller couldn't quite place, a metallic tang, perhaps, of blood. Several Japanese men, a crude mixture of local auxiliary guards in ill-fitting uniforms and other opportunistic collaborators in civilian clothes, were there. They were actively brutalizing a small group of women, their faces twisted into ugly, sneering caricatures of cruelty, their eyes alight with a disturbing, cold enjoyment. The women were huddled together in a corner, a desperate mass of terror. Some wept openly, their soft sobs barely audible, while others remained terrifyingly silent, their wide, vacant eyes reflecting a primal terror that chilled Miller to his very core. Their stares held an unbearable despair, as if their very souls had already fled the confines of their violated bodies. His gaze immediately fixed on one young woman, perhaps barely out of her teens. She was on the floor, singled out, her delicate traditional clothing ripped and torn, revealing bruised, angry red skin. Her face was swollen, already discolored by savage blows, streaked with dirt and fresh tears, her lips split and bleeding. Her eyes, unfocused and distant, were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to pull at the very fabric of the room. She was curled into a desperate fetal position, her hands attempting a futile, instinctive shield over her head, her body trembling uncontrollably. Miller heard the coarse shouts of her attackers, their hands grabbing, pawing at her, their laughter chilling, devoid of any human empathy. This wasn't the brutal but often impersonal violence of combat. This was calculated, intimate cruelty against the utterly defenseless. This was something far more perverse, a violation that transcended all boundaries of decency, all rules of engagement. This was a line, Miller knew, that could not, would not be crossed. A cold, righteous fury, pure and incandescent, surged through Miller, eclipsing his usual world-weary cynicism, burning away his profound exhaustion. He would not stand by. He could not. His men, too, had their weapons raised, their faces contorted into masks of shock and profound disgust. Miller stepped fully, decisively into the room, his imposing presence and the clear, stark lines of his American uniform, an abrupt, alien intrusion. His shadow stretched long and menacing across the scene, momentarily eclipsing the dancing light of the lantern. "Halt! What in God's name is going on here?" His voice, sharp, commanding, and ringing with an unexpected authority, sliced through the horrifying cacophony of shouts and whimpers like a honed steel blade. The brutal laughter died abruptly. The coarse shout ceased mid-word. A sudden, terrifying, absolute silence descended upon the room, broken only by the soft, trembling sob of one of the women. The Japanese guards, utterly startled, froze mid-action, their expression shifting from leering cruelty to a mix of bewildered fear and nervous defiance. Their eyes, wide with surprise, flickered between Miller and the huddled women, then back to the American officer, clearly sizing him up. One of them, a stout man with a greasy, sneering face and a patch of dried blood on his sleeve, began to babble, a rapid-fire torrent of agitated Japanese. He gestured dismissively, almost contemptuously at the women. "They are disorderly. These women are criminals. They are ours." His tone was indignant, almost aggrieved, as if they were the ones being unjustly interrupted in a legitimate, even necessary activity. His posture suggested a pathetic attempt to reassert dominance. Miller ignored the torrent of unintelligible words. He didn't need a translator to understand the man's intent, the unspoken arrogance behind his claims. He saw through their pathetic, transparent excuses, saw the naked cruelty in their eyes. His gaze was unwavering, a laser-like focus on the trembling young woman on the floor. He advanced purposefully, his heavy boots making deliberate, echoing steps across the rough floor, past the bewildered attackers, past the other women who watched with bated breath, their faces a mixture of terror and dawning, fragile hope. They seemed unsure if this new, powerful presence represented salvation or merely another, more powerful form of torment. Miller stopped directly before Aiko, his shadow falling over her small, cowering form. The only sound was the soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of his boots as he adjusted his stance. He knelt slightly, extending a hand towards her, a gesture so unexpected, so utterly alien to her recent experience. It felt like an impossible dream. It was a gesture of connection, an offer of succor amidst the swirling miasma of violence. Aiko, still half-conscious in her terror, flinched violently, recoiling from the outstretched hand, from the uniform that until mere days ago had represented the ultimate, all-consuming enemy. Disbelief warred with a primal, deeply ingrained fear. Her eyes, though, slowly, agonizingly lifted, meeting his. There was a profound, almost paralyzing terror there. Yes, but then, a fragile, almost imperceptible spark of something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps a sliver of hope, a desperate, nascent flicker of recognition that this enemy was not here to inflict further harm. He lowered himself further. His voice, when it came, was firm, resolute, cutting through the stunned, suffocating silence of the room. It echoed, clear and strong, like a divine pronouncement, a pronouncement of justice. "Enough. You're with me now." The words, though in a foreign tongue, hung in the putrid air, laden with an unmistakable weight. They were a definitive command to the aggressors, an unshakable promise to the victim, a resounding declaration of human dignity that reverberated through the shattered lives of every woman in that horrifying room. For a brief, suspended moment, Aiko seemed to process the incomprehensible implications of those words, not literally, perhaps, but through their sheer, undeniable force. The enemy soldier was not threatening her, but unequivocally, miraculously, saving her. A microscopic seed of hope, long believed dead and buried in the desolate garden of her soul, began, tentatively, to stir, to push through the layers of despair. The perpetrators, still reeling from the sudden, unexpected intrusion, shuffled nervously, their bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The power dynamic, so utterly theirs moments before, had shifted entirely, irrevocably. They now knew, with a primal, instinctive certainty, that they dared not challenge this armed American officer. His presence, his unwavering gaze, carried an authority far greater than their petty local cruelties. To resist, they understood, would invite dire, incalculable consequences. Miller, his grip gentle but firm, helped Aiko to her feet, supporting her small, trembling frame as her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. She was barely able to stand. He led her towards the door, his movements deliberate, methodical, away from her tormentors, away from the grim reality of that defiled room. Davis and Jenkins, their rifles held ready, eyes scanning the room, quickly moved to form a protective cordon around them, their own faces grim and set, but now resolute in their sergeant's unexpected righteous mission. The other women, still huddled in their corner, watched in a mixture of awe and fear, silent witnesses to an act of courage and defiance that utterly transcended the brutal logic of their war-torn world. The journey from the transition center to the American camp was a blur for Aiko, a fragmented tapestry woven from pain, disorientation, and a terrifying, unbelievable hope. Her body was a symphony of agony, bruises blooming in angry purples and reds, cuts stinging, muscles screaming with fatigue and fear. But it was the profound disarray of her mind that truly overwhelmed her, threatening to unravel the fragile thread of her consciousness. Each hesitant, painful step was a monumental effort, a battle against the rising tide of ingrained terror and the utter disbelief of her current reality. She was being escorted by an American soldier, one of the very men whose army had rained fire upon her homeland, whose presence represented the ultimate symbol of defeat. Yet, this same man, this towering, silent figure, had saved her. The surreal nature of the experience was almost too much for her traumatized mind to bear. Miller walked beside her, his silence more reassuring than any torrent of foreign words could have been. His presence, solid and unwavering, was an anchor in her storm. His men, Davis and Jenkins, maintained a respectful distance, their weapons, once instruments of war, now symbols of a bewildering, unexpected protection. The stark contrast between the squalor, darkness, and degradation she had just left, and the ordered, though still military environment they were heading towards, was dizzying, almost disorienting. They arrived at the camp's aid station, a brightly lit canvas tent bustling with a focused, muted activity. The air, surprisingly, smelled of antiseptic and strong, freshly brewed coffee, a strange yet strangely comforting combination that signaled both injury and succor. A young female nurse, her uniform starched and clean, her face etched with a mix of weariness and professionalism, immediately saw the injured Japanese woman and the grim, determined faces of the patrol. She sprang into action with practiced efficiency. "What happened here, Sergeant?" the nurse asked, her voice calm and steady, as she began to quickly assess Aiko's visible injuries, her fingers gentle as they probed a swollen cheek. Miller explained the situation concisely, his voice tight with a suppressed, simmering anger. Found her and others being brutalized in that so-called transition center. These bastards won't be doing it again tonight. The implication was clear. He would ensure justice, or at least a measure of it. The nurse, whose name was Lieutenant Mary Jenkins, no relation to Corporal Jenkins, though they shared a brief, knowing glance, nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at Aiko's broken figure. "All right, Sergeant, you did good. Let's get her cleaned up and looked at. Doc, over here." Her voice rose slightly, calling for the duty doctor. Aiko was gently led to a clean cot, covered with a surprisingly soft, if somewhat rough, military-issue blanket. A kind-faced doctor, Dr. Thompson, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscled forearms, his brow furrowed with concern, began to examine her. His hands were surprisingly gentle, his movements precise and professional, a stark contrast to the brutal hands that had recently violated her. Lieutenant Jenkins offered her a fresh woolen blanket, its rough softness a foreign, almost shocking sensation against her bruised skin. Then came a cup of warm tea, the sweet, earthy liquid a burning shock to her parched throat, a first taste of something restorative after a lifetime of bitterness. Finally, a set of simple, coarse military tunic and trousers were offered, a chance to shed the torn, defiled remnants of her traditional clothing. It was a profound act of dignity, a silent, symbolic shedding of the old, broken self, an opportunity to reclaim a basic, fundamental piece of her personhood. The military aid station, a place of healing, began, tentatively, to feel less like a prison and more like an improbable sanctuary. Language remained a formidable barrier, a wall between them, but compassion, Aiko discovered, transcended it. Gestures, gentle smiles, and a few broken, painstakingly pronounced Japanese phrases from Private Davis, who had studied the language in college, communicated reassurance rather than interrogation. They asked for her name, where she was from, but without pressure, their questions soft, understanding that the answers might not come easily, or perhaps ever. An interpreter, a somber-faced young Japanese man pressed into service by the occupation forces, was quickly located and brought to the tent. His presence allowed for the first tentative, halting steps towards actual communication, but the bulk of the care was delivered through unspoken empathy. Miller watched from a distance, a silent sentinel, leaning against a tent pole near the entrance. He held a cup of lukewarm coffee, its bitterness a fitting end to the night's events, the ceramic mug a small comfort in his calloused hands. He was utterly exhausted, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving him hollowed out, drained. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was simply a soldier who had acted on instinct, on a principle that had been forged not in the training camps, but in the brutal crucible of war itself. He hadn't sought this moment, this act of intervention. He had merely responded. The weight of human suffering was immense, a crushing burden that often felt insurmountable. But in this small, brightly lit corner of a broken world, he had, for a fleeting moment, managed to lift a sliver of it. He took a final gulp of coffee, its warmth fading as quickly as the night's urgency. Aiko lay on the cot, wrapped securely in the rough but clean blanket. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled her nostrils, no longer alien and frightening, but a strangely comforting, almost protective presence. The warmth of the tea seeped into her very bones, chasing away the deep, pervasive chill that had permeated her being for so long. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She watched Dr. Thompson and Lieutenant Jenkins move with a quiet, practiced efficiency, their faces etched with professional concern, not contempt or judgment. These were the enemy, she thought, the very people her nation had fought to the bitter end. Yet they offered her a kindness, a gentle solicitude she had not received from her own people, from her own kind. The officer's words, "You're with me now," echoed in the deepest recesses of her mind. No longer a foreign threat, but a protective incantation, a shield against the darkness. The primal terror still lingered, a phantom limb of her recent ordeal, a memory etched too deeply to simply vanish, but it was slowly, tentatively, giving way to a bewildered relief, a fragile, nascent trust. Liberation, she realized with a jolt that was both painful and exhilarating, could come from the most unexpected sources, from the very hands that once aimed to destroy. The story of Sergeant Miller's unexpected, audacious intervention spread quietly through the American camp, a ripple effect across the ordered rows of tents and barracks. Soldiers, many of them already cynical and jaded by the prolonged, often thankless task of occupation, reacted with a complex mixture of emotions. There was admiration, certainly, for Miller's courage and decisive action, a quiet understanding among those who had witnessed similar barbarities on the battlefield, and, for some, perhaps a touch of cynical amusement or resentment about getting involved in local affairs beyond their mandated duties. But for a significant number, the incident served as a subtle yet profound moral anchor, a stark reminder of the humanity they still carried within them, even amidst the harsh, dehumanizing realities of their military existence. It was a moment that cut through the bureaucratic indifference, touching upon a deeper, universal sense of right and wrong. Miller, predictably, faced a stern, pointed questioning from his commanding officer, Captain Davies, a man more concerned with regulations and the delicate balance of occupation policy than with moral crusades. "Sergeant," Davies had stated, his voice tight, "your actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, were outside the established protocol. You risked an international incident, not to mention the lives of your men for—" "What, exactly?" Miller stood ramrod straight, his face impassive, but his eyes held an unyielding glint. "Sir, there are some things a man just can't walk away from. I saw women being tortured. My men saw it. We couldn't let it continue." He didn't offer a lengthy justification. His reasoning was simple, visceral, and, for him, entirely sufficient. His quiet defiance against the pervasive apathy that sometimes characterized the occupation was unwavering, a silent battle against the erosion of basic human decency. He knew he might face reprimand, perhaps even a transfer, but he also knew with absolute clarity that he would not have acted differently. For Aiko, that single defiant act of humanity, that unexpected stand by an enemy soldier, became her unforeseen turning point. She didn't know what her future held. The path ahead was shrouded in the murky uncertainty of a defeated nation, but the immediate restoration of her physical safety, the gentle professional care she received, and the profound, almost miraculous kindness of an erstwhile enemy had given her something she thought long dead, a chance to reclaim a fragment of her shattered dignity. She would eventually be moved to a more secure, genuinely supportive refugee facility, away from the lingering threats of her past. There, surrounded by other women who understood her silent suffering, she would begin the agonizing, arduous process of healing, of attempting to rebuild a life from the ashes of her youth. The path would be long, fraught with pain and memory, but the first crucial step towards reclaiming her agency, towards finding a voice, had been taken. In the grand, brutal tapestry of war, where nations clashed with titanic force and millions perished in a vast, impersonal calculus of destruction, such an individual act might seem utterly insignificant, a mere footnote in the annals of history. Yet, it challenged the very perceptions, the very narratives of hatred and dehumanization that war relentlessly fostered. The enemy, the American soldier, had unexpectedly become the rescuer, shattering the carefully constructed propaganda and the deeply ingrained prejudices on both sides. It was a potent testament to the profound, transformative power of individual compassion, a stark, radiant reminder that even in the darkest, most chaotic corners of human experience, a single act of kindness, a moment of courage, an unwavering assertion of humanity, could possess an immense, life-altering impact. It could, for one person, alter the very trajectory of their fate, offering a glimmer of hope to those forgotten by the very nation that had exploited them. Dignity, Aiko learned, could be unexpectedly reclaimed, and liberation found in the most improbable of hands, from the most unlikely of sources. As night fell again over Yokohama, casting long shadows across the recovering city, Aiko lay on her cot in the aid station. A fragile, unfamiliar peace had settled over her, a momentary respite from the relentless torment of her memories. She dreamt not of terror, not of the leering faces of her captors, but of a quiet, new beginning, a path tentatively opening before her. Somewhere across the sprawling American camp, Sergeant Miller stood, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the occupied city. He knew, with the deep certainty of a weary veteran, that he couldn't single-handedly change the world, couldn't undo the countless horrors he had witnessed, but he had, for one person, for Aiko, changed a world. The words he had spoken, born of righteous fury and a profound, unwavering sense of justice, resonated in the quiet night air, a powerful, enduring testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity. Enough. You're with me now. Then what do you think about this moment in history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more untold stories.